Welcome to the National Archives. Thank you for joining us on this wonderful afternoon. It's great weather outside, and thank you for those that ran across the street in the middle of the parade to get here. I'm Trevor Plante. I'm the chief of the Archives 1 Reference Services Branch, which means this building, National Archives building. Today we welcome back, because he's been here many times, Harold Holzer to discuss President Lincoln Assassinated, the first-hand story of the murder, manhunt, trial, and mourning. Harold has authored, co-authored, and edited more than 40 books. His most recent book prior to this one was Lincoln and the Power of the Press that got very good reviews that came out last fall, and is most well known for Lincoln at Cooper Union. I'm not going to go into all of Harold's bio. It's in the pamphlet that you received. I can guarantee you he's been on many more channels than are listed in that program. And if by now you don't know who Harold Holzer is, shame on you. When he comes up, I'll let him talk about the small, obscure museum that he works at in New York City. The last few years, we've been celebrating various 150th anniversary milestones for the Civil War. Several anniversaries are happening rapidly right now. Last week, it was Lee's surrender to Grant at Appomattox. This week, we marked anniversaries of the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln at Ford's Theater, and as recently as yesterday morning at 7:22 a.m., the morning of his death at the Peterson House. Now we're in the 150th anniversary of the hunt for his assassin, John Wilkes Booth. If you haven't already done so, please take time to view the featured document that we have on display upstairs. We have on temporary display the report of the doctor who treated Lincoln the night he was shot, titled "A Doctor in the House," Dr. Charles Leal's report on the death of President Lincoln. It's in the East Rotunda Gallery, and that will be on display through April 29th. So it has a very short time frame, so please be sure to check that out on your way out. We have 2 copies of Dr. Leal's report at the National Archives, the one that's on display that's signed by the doctor upstairs currently, and then the other one that is actually cited in Harold's book. I'd like you to join us this Saturday. We have several presentations beginning at 11 o'clock, and this is mentioned in the program. A Finger in Lincoln's Brain by Abel, Marching Home by Brian Jordan, Their Last Full Measure, Joseph Whelan, and this Monday night, Capital Dames, The Civil War and the Women of Washington by Cokie Roberts. So I know you didn't come to hear me speak, you came to hear Harold speak. So ladies and gentlemen, Harold Holzer.
Well, thank you. How great to see all these people here. I thought when I saw the sunshine and the parade and the floats that no one would make it into the entrance, and I'm glad to see you. And I'm also glad because I was worried a little bit after Ford's Theater that everything after the morning of April 15th would be somewhat anticlimactic. And I hope it's not. I hope this interest continues to sustain itself and it's not just pegged to sesquicentennial anniversaries. There will be other ways to remember, other ways to explore. I hope we can do it throughout 15 and 16. I see my friend Peter Colasanti here. He has a gallery in Georgetown called L'Enfant Gallery, which you should look for because in May it will celebrate the 150th anniversary of the Grand Review with an exhibit of Ulysses S. Grant material and other materials. So things go on. Of course, that is pegged to an anniversary and contradicts everything I just said, but please ignore it. Anyway, we know what the subject today and this week is, and I want to start with a quote, which I'm going to clean up a little bit. That means Negro citizenship. That's the last speech he will ever make. And that's what an infuriated John Wilkes Booth vowed as he was listening to Abraham Lincoln deliver an address on Reconstruction from a second-floor White House window 150 years and 5 days ago on April 11th, 1865. That's what Booth vowed. Or did he? You know, Lincoln's address that night was sort of benign, ironically. It was not all the kind of flag-waving victory speech that winners of wars are prone to make that are likely to infuriate the losers of the war. In fact, it was in spirit almost an epilogue to his rather pacific second inaugural address delivered 6 weeks earlier. Lincoln really did bear malice toward none. He really did propose to extend charity for all, even to rebels who had waged their bloody war to fracture the Union and preserve slavery. He also really did mean to help ex-slaves who had fought both for their own freedom and for the sanctity of the Union that had enshrined slavery in its Constitution for so long. And technically, of course, the Constitution still did protect slavery, although that was on the way to change with passage of the 13th Amendment coming quickly, unfortunately not in Lincoln's lifetime. So Lincoln gives his speech. It's not his most, triumphant speech. It's not his greatest speech by any means. It was a long and detailed speech. Partisan to the end, the Democratic newspapers criticized it. One of them charged that Lincoln had groped around the Reconstruction issue like a traveler in an unknown country without a map. It took a Republican newspaper, of course, they were all partisan in those days, to recognize the speech as wise in sentiment and pervaded by the logic of the heart. It's a little anomalous, but that's what they said. Well, Booth would not have agreed that April 11th evening because he was there, watching Lincoln's haggard face illuminated by bonfires as the president pronounced the words that Booth and other white supremacist Southerners had long dreaded. Voting rights were indeed coming for the colored man, as Lincoln put it, albeit for the very intelligent and those who serve our cause as soldiers. Limited rights, limited charity, and certainly not for all. But as far as John Wilkes Booth was concerned, enough. That means Negro citizenship. That's the last speech he'll ever make. And just as Booth promised, it was. Could even Lincoln's favorite dramatist, William Shakespeare, have created such a perfect ending? Think of it. A beloved and benevolent leader staged high up in a well-lit window. The multitudes are sort of arrayed before him like a carpet of laurels, victorious at last, addressing his relieved and grateful subjects, people to whom liberties had been denied on both sides, and now offering in the grandest of gestures to extend liberty as no other leader had before. And standing below him, because the play has to be quite dramatic, of course, on the White House lawn, otherwise choked with joyous admirers, his face, contorted with rage, was his future murderer, hissing to a Confederate, small c, that means Negro citizenship. That's the last speech he will ever make. And I hope you know as I repeat this mantra that, of course, Booth did not use the word Negro when he said that. Just a few months earlier, in a screed that he wrote for the presidential election campaign, never recited, thought he would be making a speech or publishing it in the paper. He never did. He had been clear. This country was formed by the white, not for the black man. To strike at wrong and oppression was the teaching of our fathers. The study of our early history will not let me forget it. And he didn't. That means Negro citizenship. That's the last speech he will ever make. Now, this famous line sounds especially familiar, I think, to those of us who have been reading about new assassination sesquicentennial books, and there are a lot of them, and for good reason. Always part of April 1865 literature and lore, it's resurfaced in recent months all over. But to put it in context, as far back as 30 years ago, the late William Hanchett made it central to motive in his influential book, The Lincoln Murder Conspiracies. That most respected of recent assassination experts, Edward Steers, exhumed it in 2001. Michael Kaufman, in his 2004 Booth book, American Brutus, used the quote too, and then, interestingly, questioned its authenticity in the footnotes. Even James McPherson has used it in Battle Cry, and he quoted Hanchett as his source. And the list goes on. Terry Alford, in his really splendid new biography of John Wilkes Booth, Fortune's Fool, quotes it without offering any sources at all. And then major book reviews published on the very same morning, just a few weeks ago, in both the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal on the same Saturday. One by Jill Lepore, the Wonder Woman historian, one by Michael Burlingame, both writing about the Alford book and another new book called Mourning Lincoln by Martha Hodes, another very good book. Each began with the identical lead. And guess what that was? That means Negro citizenship, et cetera, et cetera. And like Booth, neither Jill Lepore nor Michael Burlingame used the sanitized word. They used the N word that I won't use today. Well, if we know that Booth was a racist, literally terrorized by the impending doom of white supremacy, and we're reasonably sure as well, and Alford certainly reiterates this in his book, that the actor was kind of unhinged, confusing his stage roles with real life, especially his final stage role as Mark Antony, who not only gets to kill his Caesar, his tyrant, but to deliver the funeral oration, then why quibble? Well, because I think the devil is in the details. And as the two most recent books about Lincoln's death and aftermath show us, Americans, I think, have largely looked to expunge their own devils, their own history, their own guilt in the way we're now remembering Lincoln's murder. We've seen the best and worst of ourselves in Lincoln's life and death, and in how we think Lincoln might have bound up the nation's wounds and cared for those who bore the battle, the way we lost him in a careless moment of jubilation, the way we lamented his death and sanctified his memory since as a liberator. But did people really know that Booth was attacking Lincoln because of the prospect of, quote, Negro citizenship? So let's dispose of the quote, if it can be disposed of at all, 150 years and layer upon layer of use and reuse later. We do know for certain that Booth attended what he indeed made sure was Lincoln's last speech, a few blocks from here at the White House on April 11th. And what's the source? Well, the only real source is an 1867 transcript of testimony before the House Judiciary Committee by former Assistant Secretary of War Thomas Eckert, 1867. And it's in the Johnson impeachment hearings, not anything to do with the assassination. And they brought Eckert to testify to try to find out if Andrew Johnson was complicit in the attacks on Lincoln and Seward. A ridiculous avenue of investigation, but they did it. And Eckert testified that he had spoken to Lewis Payne before his execution 2 full years earlier. Even that's not a great source, but it's the only source. And this is what Eckert says. Booth tried to get me to shoot the president the night of the celebration after the fall of Richmond. We think that's April 11th. It could have been a couple of days before. The president made a speech that night from one of the windows of the White House, and he, meaning Powell, and Booth were in the grounds in front. Booth tried to persuade him to shoot the president while in the window, but Powell told Booth he would take no such risk, that he left then and walked around the square, and that Booth remarked, "That is the last speech he will ever make." Just that is the last speech he will ever make. Now, that's quite a different story. Booth asks Payne to shoot Lincoln maybe even before he calls for black voting rights. No mention of the line at all, "This means Negro citizenship." And the vow is not made daringly, almost recklessly, in front of hundreds of admirers, but whispered in the darkness, I presume, of Lafayette Square, maybe even while Lincoln is still speaking. Maybe you can even hear a little bit of his voice as they're walking away. So where does this "that means Negro citizenship" part come in? Well, apparently it comes from a Civil War newspaper correspondent named George Alfred Townsend, whose reports on the Lincoln assassination and the capture of Booth were eventually collected in a very well-respected book. It's considered an original on-the-spot source of the manhunt and the trial. And guess what? The Negro citizenship line doesn't appear in that book at all. During the war, by the way, he was known as Gath. That was his pen name. I'll refer to him that way. It's made up of George Alfred Townsend, his first three initials, plus H, a play on a line from the Bible, from the book of Samuel, "Tell it not in Gath." Gath was a Philistine city, home to Goliath, interestingly. So don't tell a whopper. Get it? Gath is telling the truth. In those days, people would have gotten it. So the question is whether Gath wound up telling a giant whopper of his own when he got the chance. And he did get the chance. In 1895, when he published a turgid novel, a novel, mind you, not a memoir, not a history, and it was a story called Katie of Catoctin, or The Chainbreakers, a national romance. No wonder no one has cited this source. Historical fiction, 19th century style, and at one point, Gath's characters, real and invented alike, go to the White House. Go to the White House lawn on April 11th to hear President Lincoln speak. And Townsend remembers Lincoln uttered these very words: "If universal amnesty is granted to the insurgents, I cannot see how I can avoid exacting in return universal suffrage, or at least suffrage on the basis of intelligence and military service." Lincoln hadn't said that. I mean, said a version of it. So if we understand that he's making that up, let's go to the next part. Townsend goes on in the novel, "Booth was standing before Mr. Lincoln on the outskirts of the large assemblage. 'That means Negro citizenship,' he said to little Harold by his side. 'Now, by God, I'll put him through.'" Not that's the last speech he will ever make. "Now, by God, I'll put him through." And it was to Davy Harold, not Lewis Powell, during the speech, not afterward. So if Townsend invents the words of the speech, why not the reaction? So there it is. That's the real source for the legendary vow to prevent black voting rights, an invented line of dialogue. Though, to be fair to Townsend, he does offer a kind of third-hand source by putting an asterisk on this section of his novel, and he writes on the bottom, "Frederick Stone, counsel for David Harold after Booth's death, told me that this was the occasion of deliberate murder being resolved upon by Booth, and in the words above." I don't know. But that's maybe why Ed Steers put all three declarations together from two sources, House testimony, Gath fiction, and came up with one conjoined, if dubious, quote. "That means Negro citizenship. Now, by God, I will put him through. That will be the last speech he will ever make." And I've spoken to Ed Steers about this, and he said, "Oh my God, maybe I shouldn't have done that." Anyway, so there's my attempt at myth-busting for the day. And I know I'm not going to win this fight. I have a feeling that if civilization ended 20,000 years from now, explorers would come and find two things: a cockroach, and that means Negro citizenship. It's that hard to squash. And I have to admit that I wanted to use the story myself in the new book, President Lincoln Assassinated, attributed to the novel. But it was irresistible. And I have to admit that until I started doing the book and assembling the material and researching the sources for the testimony, and then the second section, the lamentations by poets and orators about Lincoln's death, I've been using the quote often. I get people to cry when I use that quote. I'm not going to use it anymore because, unfortunately, I've killed it for everybody, and I might as well take the hit myself. And I think we can get into Booth's motives without over-dramatizing. That he was grandiose and deluded, I don't think anyone can doubt anymore, especially in the wake of Terry Alford's really convincing new analysis of sort of malice and breakdown. That he was deeply racist, heart and soul, is evident in everything he said and did. The trouble is he didn't publish it, so we can't know that people knew it as a motive. And that, I think, is why they ascribed his act to everything from Jefferson Davis's leadership and influence to the Pope, to the Knights of the Golden Circle, to the Masons. I heard that again yesterday at Ford's Theater. He saw Lincoln as a tyrant, more than deserving of violent overthrow. That cannot be denied. And Martha Hodes, in particular, among all the authors I've talked about today, has made a good case that we've tended to oversimplify the reaction to Booth and the public response to Lincoln's death. And I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about that as well, because, as James Swanson has pointed out, there were two emotional responses occurring at the same time from mid-April to early May, and that is grief and a thirst for revenge in the manhunt for Booth. But as Martha has reminded us, lamentation for Lincoln was not universal, and we'll get to that too. How do we balance all this out? How do we seek out not only motivation, but a true sense of public reaction? And Martha Hodes has asserted that there was a huge indifference or exultation, not only in the South, but among Copperheads in the North, glad that Lincoln was dead. So how do we count the real ways? I'm going to try. First, let's think of Lincoln. Absence of malice, to be sure. The second inaugural, which Booth actually attended, menaced, almost prevented. He tried to break through a stanchion, a line that had been created in the rotunda. Lincoln crossed from the Senate chamber into the rotunda, then out toward the portico to give his speech. And according to Benjamin Brown French, the Commissioner of Public Buildings, Booth lunged forward and was held back by policemen. French said he never saw such a wild look in anyone's eyes. No metal detectors in those days. He was probably armed. Lincoln, total absence of fear. Assassination, he says to Seward, is not in the American lexicon. The fear should have come with a trip to Richmond on April 4th, before the war is over, greeted as a liberator by ex-slaves, and somehow survives the hateful stares of the white people of Richmond. Absence of bravado. Just a few days before his final speech, Lincoln jokes that he's reclaiming the song Dixie. A couple of days before that, he appears at the National Hotel and receives a captured Confederate flag from a regiment. And as he takes the flag, it snags on the balcony of the outdoor balcony of the hotel. John Wilkes Booth is in that crowd too. He wants to shoot him there because he's shown disrespect to the Confederate flag. So there are all these public occasions where they meet each other. Just a moment on the cruel irony of the religious calendar, because that plays a huge part in our emotional attachment to the Lincoln assassination. Shot on Good Friday, mourned on Passover Saturday and Easter Sunday by almost everyone in the United States, certainly everyone in the North. And I once found a letter to him by a bishop in New Hampshire who wrote to him a few weeks before to please appoint Good Friday, the 14th of April, as a day of fasting and prayer throughout the United States. Had Lincoln heeded Bishop Carleton's case, he would have been fasting, not attending the theater on that night. After years of prayer, he didn't want prayer that night. He wanted relief. But the religious connotations would not go away. Those funerals, those orations on Easter Sunday left a powerful impression. And as Herman Melville wrote, and I have the complete poem in the book. Melville is not famous for his poetry, but Good Friday was the day of the prodigy and crime, when they killed him in his pity, when they killed him in his prime of clemency and calm, when with yearning he was filled to redeem the evil-willed, and though conqueror, be kind. Not everyone agreed. Booth certainly didn't agree. He believed, hiding out in a swamp in Maryland, that when the first newspapers arrived, he would be vindicated, he would be validated, he would be lionized. Instead, even Maryland newspapers thought he had made a terrible mistake and exposed even Southern white supremacists to further wrath and indignation from northern victors of the war. Many I know, Booth wrote in his diary, the vulgar herd will blame me for what I have done for posterity, I am sure, but posterity, I am sure, will justify me. It was the spirit and ambition of Caesar that Brutus struck at. Caesar must bleed for it. There's that conflation of stage roles. To his horror, the newspapers described him as a savage who had slain a beloved leader at the peak of his fame, or again exposed the South to further danger. I am here in despair, he writes in his diary. And why? For doing what Brutus was honored for, what made William Tell a hero. And yet I, for striking down a greater tyrant than they ever knew, am looked upon as a common cutthroat. Booth died clinging to the hope that he would become a hero. His braggadocio seems absurd now, but it would have seemed less so at the time because, remember, Lincoln was a partisan figure, and he was certainly not popular among Democrats in the North. He had won 56% of the vote in the November election. It was very good. He won almost all of the states, but 44% voted against him, and that's just in the loyal Union states. He would have been under 50% again, as he had been 4 years earlier, if the South had voted. They've shot Abe Lincoln. One Massachusetts Democrat shouted to his neighbors, "He's dead, and I'm glad he's dead." That's when local police began acting on authority to arrest people for being accessories after the fact, simply for stating their awful opinions. Even on the Republican side, a congressman named George Julian said, well, the universal feeling among the radicals here is that his death is a godsend. They actually thought that Andrew Johnson would be a tougher Reconstruction man than Lincoln. Not that manifestations of mourning did not appear. City after city adorned public buildings with so much thick black crepe and ribbon that recognizable architecture all but vanished beneath a sea of bunting, and even overpriced black cloth sold out completely. Somebody had to make money during this process, and the people who manufactured and sold black crepe did very, very well. In New York City, a young merchant named Abraham, long before he and a partner founded the retail empire, now dead, called Abraham and Straus, I don't know how many of you remember that brand, put a Lincoln bust in his shop window, one of many shopkeepers to make gestures to honor him. This is a couple of pages from a diary that someone, we don't know who it is, walking up Broadway, simply wrote down all the designs and all of the handmade tributes to Lincoln that he saw in New York City. Amazing. Initials, a time for weeping, that vengeance is not sleeping. Woe to the hand that shed this costly blood. Well done, thou good and faithful servant. A glorious career of service and devotion is crowned with a martyr's death. When word of Lincoln's death reached a Union Army camp in Virginia, a Pennsylvania soldier observed, "A gloom fell on us like a pall. What a hold old honest Abe had on the hearts of the soldiers of the army. It could only be told by the way they showed their mourning for him." Of course there were people who disagreed. The Chattanooga Daily Rebel aptly named, editorialized, "Abe has gone to answer before the bar of God for the innocent blood which he has permitted to be shed and in his efforts to enslave free people." The Galveston News says that Lincoln had sowed the wind and has reaped the whirlwind. In the plenitude of his power and arrogance, he was struck down and is so ushered into eternity with innumerable crimes and sins to answer for. Jefferson Davis, who was later accused of leading the conspiracy to kill Lincoln, allegedly said when he heard the news, when he was on the run, he quoted Macbeth, Lincoln's favorite play, ironically, and said, "If it were done, it were better it were well done." Later, he allegedly said, "I fear it will be disastrous for my people." And in his memoirs, he admitted, "For an enemy so relentless in the war for our subjugation, we could not be expected to mourn. Yet in view of its political consequences, it could not be regarded otherwise than as a great misfortune for the South." Now, this new book, Mourning Lincoln, which I'm going to do a little bit of a critique of here, but I still recommend because its author, Martha Hodes, went through 1,000 diaries to collect the thoughts of real, ordinary people, North as well as South. And certainly she found things, some of which we knew and some entirely new. Sarah Morgan, a famous diarist in Louisiana, wrote, "The man who is progressing to murder countless human beings is interrupted in his work by the shot of an assassin." Not very nice words. Mary Chesnut, the most famous Confederate diarist of all, writes, "The death of Lincoln, I call that a warning to tyrants. He will not be the last president put to death in the Capitol, though he is the first." But even as such furtive comments were being recorded, and I think that's where we have to keep the balance, these magnificent funerals are taking place in Washington, in Baltimore, not a city that supported Lincoln. He got 2% of the vote in Baltimore in 1860. Harrisburg, Philadelphia, New York, Albany, Buffalo, Cleveland, Columbus, Indianapolis, Chicago, and finally Springfield. Scenes of grief playing out repeatedly. New York City, the scene of vicious racist draft riots 2 years earlier, hosts a grand funeral. 100,000 New Yorkers wait online in this building where my wife used to work, City Hall in New York City, to walk up the staircase and view the remains. That's where the only photograph of Lincoln in death is taken and then confiscated by Edwin Stanton. 1 million people participated in the funeral. Even the Democratic press, which had criticized him, said it was an extraordinary showing. Here's a Currier and Ives print of the funeral. Of course, I have to be honest about my city. The Arrangements Committee said no African Americans could march in the funeral. They appealed to Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War. He said, "You have to allow African Americans to march in the funeral. I order it." It's interesting that he thought he had authority, but they said, "Okay, we're listening to you. The African American delegation can march, but they have to march at the very back of the parade." And they did, so far back that when they reached the depot where Lincoln's remains were being placed to ship to Albany, they say that his body had already reached West Point. That's how long the parade was and how indifferent they were. Nowhere do I find the reaction to the death of Lincoln more bizarre than the fact that I learned that in Charleston, South Carolina, a photo vendor began hawking photographs of John Wilkes Booth. Now, Charleston is the place where the Civil War had begun. What does it mean? Was it a resurgence of sympathy for the lost cause? Was it the hope that Booth had actually destroyed the Union government and maybe the war could be rekindled? Well, guess who owned this copy, this very copy that I'm showing here? The Lincoln family. When the Lincoln family album was rediscovered in the 1980s, it included just a curiosity piece that was still in this carte de visite album that Mary Lincoln had begun assembling when she reached Washington, a photograph of the man who had murdered the family patriarch. So I've offered a real cross-section of written evidence here with special attention to the new books, which I think deserve mentioning. Even my collection and these new books have to come with caveats. They're a sampling. They're a slice. Mourning was certainly not universal, but it was huge. I don't think you can equate 100,000 people visiting Lincoln's remains to 1,000 people writing unpleasant things in a diary. They're not the same. I don't think we can do revisionist history on the mourning of Lincoln. But I want to end this talk. Don't get too excited. It's not really ending precisely. But I want to do the final section of my talk, turning to an aspect of history that really the beginning of my study of Lincoln 40 years ago, and that's in Lincoln imagery. Because as I found when I began the study and all through the study, these are just not just pictures. They tell you a lot. Engravings and lithographs, pictures that people could purchase to hang on their walls at home, not put away, bore an almost sacred value for their owners. To their manufacturers, they were no more than a product, items in an inventory. Now that may sound heartless, but it cuts to an essential truth. If a great many of these images survive, a great many of them were made. If a great many of them were made at the time, it was because a great many customers clamored for them and purchased them and treasured them. So in a sense, very little else, not an isolated headline, not a drunken comment by a neighbor in Boston, not even a eulogy in church, not a secret diary entry, really can reflect public taste in a way, public opinion and public reaction better than public and popular prints. So here's my own Lincoln assassination look now that I think gives you an example of what I'm talking about. So just a few months earlier, Courier and Ives in New York says Lincoln is a partisan figure. He's not the best man to lead the country. He and Jefferson Davis are literally ripping the country apart. Only George McClellan can save it. And that ends, of course, when this print is recorded just a few days after the assassination. Record production time. Of course, it's not completely accurate. How can it be? It conflates the event. Lincoln was probably not gripping an American flag. He's looking the wrong way. But people were going to buy anything they could get their hands on because there's no CNN, there's no Fox, there's no MSNBC, there's no Instagram. People had to imagine these things, and they wanted them. Even this ridiculous scene of Rathbone actually having a chance of interfering, and Lincoln a little bit bulked up, shall we say, for this event. Here he's not even sitting in the right place. This is an unknown print, and I like it because it gets a quote out of Macbeth. And I don't know if they knew Lincoln loved Macbeth. This martyr has borne his faculties so meek, the deep damnation of his taking off. It's quite amazing. I suppose this is my favorite because it's got, Booth could not have broken his leg if he just stepped off a little balcony like this. It's got Lincoln standing up after he was shot and holding his eye. The musicians attempting to attack him, or at least, yeah, here we go. I love the guy who's trying to look at the whole thing through his flute. This is the Lincoln look-alike. They should have put him in the box. Now, if I had to find a suspect who was a collaborator in this event, I would do this guy. He's the only one who's not looking at the scene. What does this show? It shows that people would buy anything in this period. And here is a real indication of the motive issue. Satan tempting Booth to the murder of the president. Some of you who were at Ford's may have heard this print being discussed. What could be the motive? It's not Negro citizenship early on. This man had to be pushed by the devil himself. Now, that's only one genre of memorializing Lincoln, and I've shown you just a sampling, and there are hundreds and hundreds of surviving prints. There's also the quest to be at the deathbed, in the dying moments of Lincoln. Mary Lincoln, shown weeping here, was actually barred from the room by an unsympathetic Secretary of War, Stanton, who thought she was crying too loudly. Mary cried out for Tad. Bring Tad to this room. Surely he will speak to him. And Tad was never brought from the White House, but they have him in the print. And you have, a small collection of people in the room, which is appropriate. But when the print first came out, some people noticed perhaps that Andrew Johnson was not in it, and that was not a good thing for the transition. So if you see General Halleck here, he's expendable, so General Halleck becomes Andrew Johnson. They just replace him. And then maybe people realize that Mary was not in the room. And in this third version, this is all by Currier and Ives, you have an ever-growing number of people. And now Andrew Johnson is right up here weeping at the bedside, and he actually just paid a perfunctory visit to the bedside. Prints come out for his German admirers, too. English and German captions. Alexander Gardner, who took some of the greatest photographs of Lincoln, wants to get in on the act. This very realistic picture, it's an engraving, although for a while, leading historian of photography insisted that that was an autopsy photograph, but I don't think it is. One of the few prints to show actual blood. The most bizarre Johnson tribute of all. Here he gets to hold Lincoln's hand as he dies. The minister in full regalia is doing the tribute. What Mary and Robert Lincoln are doing here, I really don't know. Now here's my favorite. Alonzo Chapel. I think 46 people in the room. All of them were there at one point. All of them posed. Many of them posed for their images here. Robert Lincoln posed with a handkerchief for a photographer. Johnson did. Hugh McCulloch did. All of these survived in the Chicago Historical Society. Stanton. This gentleman here is featured in the New York Historical Society's new exhibition, Lincoln and the Jews. Dr. Lieberman, an ophthalmologist who was summoned to the scene. And of course, this is published with a key so that you can identify all the people in the print. A painting that became a print. And of course, people were not satisfied just for this. They wanted to know that Lincoln had the kind of afterlife he deserved. Rising, being called to heaven from his deathbed. Honored in funerals across the country. Or, indeed, welcomed by faith, hope, and charity into heaven. People looked at this print and I don't know what they thought. Why is there a Native American here in this print? Why a Masonic symbol? Lincoln was not a member of the Masons. Well, that's because there was such a rush for these pictures, these tributes, that people copied anything they could get their hands on. And this is actually an apotheosis print that was issued in 1800 for George Washington, for whom these symbols were absolutely appropriate. Oh, here's faith, hope, and charity. I knew they were here somewhere. These are obviously angels. So they just took out Washington's head, changed the words on the tomb, and they got Lincoln coming out. Gone was the vision of emancipation that reigned in 1863 and 4. Where Adelbert Volk of Baltimore could say in a print that Lincoln was dipping his pen in Satan's inkwell with his foot on the Bible when he wrote the Emancipation Proclamation. Gone was this 1864 image, miscegenation. If Lincoln is reelected, it'll be a topsy-turvy society with white men, including Lincoln, bowing to mixed-race couples, black and white couples spooning, and most horrendous of all, a white driver driving a black couple. This was the society Lincoln was ushering in. Now the view of emancipation was that of a great liberator, and people collected these prints as well. They collected images of the Lincoln family, many of them. They didn't start coming out until 1865, when Lincoln was already dead. People needed assurances, even if they weren't true, that Lincoln had enjoyed the support of his family during the horrible years of the Civil War. Even though Robert Lincoln wrote he scarcely had 5 minutes alone with his father during the entire war, and Mary wrote that she was lucky if she saw him at 11 o'clock at night for a brief talk about the events of the day. Civil War White House was not conducive to family life. And so the murder had changed everything. And I think we should not be too generous about Booth's motives. We should not think he was even a crusader for white supremacy, even if he was. I think it was a vengeance act of a deranged person. I think there was a racist element in it, but I think it's important to keep our words precise, keep our sources precise, and use visual evidence, which is almost as good as the written evidence. And here is one particularly instructive image. It's actually the cover of Martha Hode's book. Crude though it looks today, racial stereotypes acknowledged, showing a Lincoln memorial tablet engraved with an image of the martyr. The dragon of secession is finally slain. The Emancipation Proclamation engraved on an official-looking scroll. The chains of slavery are broken. Columbia is in mourning, and a newly liberated African American is holding his head in tears. So maybe this means Negro citizenship, or at least points to a future that Lincoln and his sacrifice would make better than the past. Thank you. Thanks. So I think we have 10 or 15 minutes for questions if anyone has them. There are 2 microphones. Yes, sir.
Hi, Carl Gollivan, JFKVigil.com. If I could please ask you to comment on the perspective of a very important participant in the tribunal, Brigadier General Thomas Harris, who published a book, having heard all the witnesses firsthand, entitled Rome's Responsibility for the Assassination of Abraham Lincoln. And Brigadier General Harris pointed out, of course, that the Pope had corresponded with Jefferson Davis and recognized him as the illustrious and honorable President of the Confederate States of America, which when Lincoln heard that, and it was all very publicized, he felt that his death warrant had been signed because by acknowledging the Confederate States, the Pope was essentially deeming Lincoln a tyrant who was unjustly making war on the South. Also that John Surratt, co-conspirator, Brigadier General Harris says that Surratt was hidden out by the Bishop of Montreal and his priests with foreknowledge of the event. And of course, Surratt then fled to London and on to where he joined the Pope's army in the Vatican. And Johnson, Harris argues, was complicit because he canceled the arrest warrant in order to make it all go away and avoided having him arrested in London.
Okay, let me comment.
Yes.
You've asked me this question before, so I'm.
But not in front of this audience.
Right. So I'm not at the archive. So I'm going to try. I have to try to remember all your points. I'll try to go in descending order from the last one. John Surratt was a serious Catholic who had gone to Catholic schools, and he was shielded by priests, and he wound up in the Papal Guards. European recognition of the Confederacy, including Vatican City recognition, was always a dicey thing for Lincoln, and it was an issue that he confronted and largely overcame during his presidency, basically by virtue of issuing the Emancipation Proclamation at the last possible minute to prevent major European recognition. But I've said this to you before, that I don't believe that there was a plot managed by the Pope to eliminate Lincoln. I point to his interesting relationship with Bishop Hughes, the Archbishop of New York, who was so mortified by the overwhelming number of Irish Catholics who participated in the draft riots, and who personally stood in front of Presbyterian and Methodist and Episcopalian churches in New York City and ordered the rioters to not touch Protestant churches, and was pretty heroic in the draft riot. So I know you believe in this, and I don't, and let's leave it at that.
Well, not that I believe in it. And again, Brigadier General Harris made it very specific. He felt it wasn't the laity of the Roman Catholic Church that was at all responsible. It was the hierarchy.
Right, the Knights of the Golden Circle and all of that. Okay, we disagree, but thank you for
As
presenting
is
it.
General Harris, yeah.
Okay, and I disagree with General Harris, I guess. John.
Yeah, hi, Harold. As you know, I'm very interested in the medical aspects of the assassination, and I'm really glad you brought up the Booth quote for a couple of reasons. Because, as you also probably know, there's a new book out called A Finger in Lincoln's Brain, and the author's going to be here Saturday, actually, in which he uses that quote, but now by God, I'll put him through, to use the premise that he was going to stab the president and not shoot him. But even worse than that in this book, he uses the motive of syphilis, Booth having syphilis, and mental changes brought about by syphilis to be the reason his personality changed from the sweet boy that he was to this aggressive murderer. Right. And I've even asked Terry Alford about this, and I can't find any other credible historian to believe in this. So my question is, what's your take on that?
Okay, well, you asked some interesting questions. Terry Alford says he wasn't such a sweet boy. That it was, when nobody was looking, he tortured cats.
True.
It's always a bad thing when kids torture. It means therapy is called for immediately. So he wasn't such a good kid, apparently. And we've heard the syphilis story. He certainly had a lot of girlfriends in his young life. But, there's also a reigning syphilis story about Lincoln, that it's the reason that his wife became ill, the reason his children died. People like to ascribe changes in personality and illness to syphilitic origins in those days.
Well, as you know, I'm an infectious disease specialist, and Booth was 26 years old, and even untreated, it takes many years to really develop those kinds of mental
Right, but
changes
Civil
from
War
syphilis.
soldiers had it. We know that from research.
And he uses the freckling and the boils and all that.
Let's not get too graphic.
Yeah, okay.
On the finger in the brain thing, I want to tell you a story that happened to me, to us in New York. An article was published in American Heritage 15 years ago. I don't remember. I'm not good at anything after 1865, really. So this article is published saying that the doctor who stuck his finger in Lincoln's brain in the box at Ford's Theater, which he did to relieve the clot
Dr.
and to
Leal,
start him
yes.
breathing again, that had Lincoln recovered, he would have killed him from the diseases that he caused by sticking an unwashed, ungloved finger into Lincoln's brain. So this doctor happened to live in the same Westchester town that my wife and I lived in. So I thought, why not invite him to the Lincoln Group of New York to discuss this ridiculous theory? Because he's going to die anyway. What difference does it make? Let him live a little bit more so he doesn't die in a theater box, which is what they were horrified about. And guess who came to the New York group when she heard about it? A woman named Helen Leal Harper, the granddaughter of Dr. Leal. And boy, was she angry. So it turned out to be a debate, a huge debate. How dare you accuse my grandfather, who rushed into the box and resuscitated this great man and prevented him from dying on the spot in the ignominious circumstances in which Booth had left him. And neither of these people ever spoke to us again, neither the neighbor nor Helen Leal Harper. So you're an infectious disease specialist. Did he kill him? If he had not been fatally injured, putting an unwashed finger in the brain.
I think that's absolutely correct. He would have certainly had infection, but what Dr. Leal did do is allow him to live at least another 9.5 hours so things could be done and people could be gathered, et cetera. So I think he did it. I'm a big fan of Dr. Leal. I lecture on him, so anybody who wants to take Dr. Leal to task, I don't like.
All right. Thanks, Doctor. Do we have time for a few more?
Yeah, we could do 2 more.
What happened on this side? The right wing is not being... Yes.
Hello. My interest in all this is of an avid amateur, and I just recently stumbled upon the story of Lucy Hale, and I'm curious, given her connections, at least that I've read about, I don't know whether they're accurate or not, with Booth, Robert Lincoln, and John Hay. The fact that she had dinner with Booth that night and spent the day with Robert Lincoln, why wasn't she called as a witness when they were arresting everybody?
You know, Alfred spends a lot of time with this. Hale, she was the daughter of an abolitionist senator, and supposedly Booth and she were actually engaged, although, Booth's promise of marriage is probably worth very little because he was such a ladies' man and so unfaithful. And that's what Bill O'Reilly makes a big case of in his book, which is that there's a triangle between Robert Lincoln and John Wilkes Booth fighting for the same woman, and Booth shoots Lincoln. I don't know. It's complicated. But really, if Lucy Hale is truly infatuated with both guys and is disregarding her family's unionism to run away to Europe, supposedly, with John Wilkes Booth, that's news to me. And if also the idea that O'Reilly's idea that Booth was jealous of Robert, that's sort of crazy. I mean, Booth is like a movie star. I mean, he's a very famous, very handsome guy. And, Robert, with all due respect, is not a movie star. He's a very prim and proper kid, and he's no competition for John Wilkes Booth in the glamour department. So I don't know if that's true. I think Booth sort of ran, I was going to say ran rampant. That's not the right word, but a rampage through the girls in town. And Lucy was supposed to be very pretty, but I don't know what the final verdict is on that one. Yes.
Hi, I'm a new member of the Lincoln Group of D.C. I've always been curious. In 1935, when Huey Long was assassinated, so many people in Louisiana hated him that lots of people thought it was maybe their brother or their father or whoever that was the assassin. Yet in the Civil War, we only have a couple of plots or alleged plots against Lincoln. I mean, he was maybe going to be assassinated before he even got to Washington for the assassination. 10,000, 20,000 Confederate soldiers would have loved to have assassinated him. How is it that it took only Booth and his conspiracy got to Lincoln, and it didn't happen, on the way from Soldiers Home one day or back and forth?
Well, it's a very good question. And Lincoln was shot at purportedly on his way to the Soldiers Home. Somebody put a bullet through his hat.
Right.
Whether it was an assassin or a sentry who just got nervous, he never again traveled alone, and he found the hat and showed it off rather proudly as a curiosity. He had a file on his desk labeled A for assassination. He kept death threats. He had hideous, vulgar death threats in his that were sent to him beginning with his election in 1860. He collected them in Springfield. He burned some of them, allegedly. They're called the hot stove letters because he put them in the stove. Some of them survived. There's one that's not in the Lincoln papers here. It's in Chicago because Robert probably didn't want it in the Lincoln papers. That has curse words and anatomical references and sexual references that I didn't know existed until the 60s, the 1960s. So he brushed them off. He thought it wasn't going to happen. And these groups that got together to plot didn't concern him. Baltimore concerned him enough, as you mentioned, for him to agree uncharacteristically not to make a public appearance. He was told by 2 or 3 different people that a credible threat from a group existed in Baltimore. And, as you know, went through the city in the dark of night in some kind of unfamiliar costume, not a Scotch cap, but probably a soft hat to avoid the fate that was waiting for him. So plots, yes. Confederate agents, yes. I was on MSNBC with someone, we were both in the makeup room. That sounds very macho. We're both in the makeup room. But he was a lieutenant colonel, so I think it was okay. And he was a special forces veteran. And we were talking about the assassination and plots and dangers to all of our presidents. And the consensus that these professionals say is plots are interceptable. It's the lone wolf, like Booth, who is a danger. Like
but he wasn't a lone wolf.
The lone wolf. But Booth was a lone wolf. He was that. I think that's this idea that he had a big conspiracy and a plot. He had a bunch of losers with him who were under his thrall, and that's his conspiracy plot. Of course, he plotted to do it, and he engaged people he thought would do a little bit more. But anyway, not officially sanctioned, according to Mr. Alford. So one more question, right?
Yeah, I just want to defend Dr. Fraser from the comment that he was causing Lincoln to die of sepsis. Never made that argument. What his argument was that sticking the finger.
Oh, is that the name of the doctor who wrote the
Yes.
article?
Yeah.
Oh, good.
He's
Tell
ill
me-
now.
tell me
I
his
think he
name.
may have died by now.
Tell me his name again.
Dr. Fraser.
Okay.
When I called up, he was very ill, so I don't know if he's still alive. But anyways, never made that point. What his point was that by sticking his finger into Lincoln's brain, he was causing further damage. That was one point. He isn't the only one who stuck his finger into Lincoln's brain. About 4 other physicians did so. Let me finish. Yeah, exactly. He wasn't supposed to do that. Wasn't supposed to do that. Manuals specifically said, don't do that. The doctor who trained Leal specifically said, don't do that. It was contrary to the medical advice of the time. But the fact that he stuck his finger in was not the thing that he should be censured for, because that's what they were all trained to do. That doesn't mean it was the wrong thing. In retrospect, it was the wrong thing, but at the time, that was the medical training, so that's what he did. The other physicians who came behind him, nobody, just like today's physicians, and you're a physician, they don't believe the other guys that have worked with him. Everybody has to do that procedure themselves. And so they stuck one finger in, 2 fingers, eventually causes a lot of damage.
Yeah.
So had he a chance to survive? Nobody really knows, but by the
brain
fact that
damage,
all those guys did it,
that's-
no chance at all.
Right. Well, it's interesting how many aspects still keep our attention, and I'm glad we kept yours today. Thank you.
Folks, just a reminder, there is a book signing one level up in the Archives bookstore. And if you really want to know more about the Lincoln death and the doctor...